Hello, this is Shay Jackson with Hype Math, and in today's video, we will be reviewing for the Texas STAAR math test for 8th graders. The concept is real number systems. We will be going over square roots. This is part 1. Remember, 8th graders, sometimes the right path is not the easiest one. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell so that you will be alerted to the new videos we upload. The problems we will be going over in this video are in our 8th grade STAAR Math Review Workbook, and it is available for purchase in our store. The link will be in the description box so that you can grab yours today. So let's do a review on square roots. The square root of a number is the positive factor that you would square to get that number. I know, that seems kind of complicated or complex, right? Well, let's break it down. The square root, for instance, of -9 is 3 because 3 squared, or 3 times 3 is equal to 9. So again, it said the square root of a number, so our number is 9, is the positive factor that you would square. So what number would you square? That means multiplying the number by itself to get that number. And in our example, we have the square root of +9. So again, you would have the square root sign and then the 9 under it. The answer is 3 because 3 squared, or 3 to the power of 2, or 3 times 3 is equal to 9. So the square root of 9 is 3. Now let's take a look at our most popular square roots all the way up into 15, and it's good to just be familiar with them. And so the first one's probably up into 11 or 12 you will recognize, but it's good to know so that whenever you're answering a question and you can't use your calculator, you can kind of think about, okay, what the square root of a number is, because they are familiar. So for instance, we have the square root of 1, of course, is equal to 1. The square root of 2 is equal to 2 because, again, 2 to the power of 2, or 2 squared, or 2 times 2, all of those things mean the same thing, is equal to 4. Okay, let's look at another one. Let's look at the square root of 64. That's equal to 8. Why? Because 8 times 8 is equal to 64. And so what we did was square, hint, square root. In order to square 8, when we square 8, we get 64. So the square root of 64 is 8. Okay, the square root of 144 is equal to 12. Why? Because 12 to the power of 2, or 12 squared, or 12 times 12 is equal to 144. So since 12 times 12, or 12 squared, is equal to 144, the square root of root is asking, and think about it, like if you think about a square, okay, we know it has to do with multiplying a number by itself, and the root, what's that number that when you multiply it by itself, to itself, it gets that number. Okay, the square root of 196 is equal to 14, and the square root of 225 is equal to 15. So if we had an example where it asks for what the square root is between two integers, for instance, if we had what two integers are, the square root of 7 is in between, we would say 2 and 3. Why? Because the square root of 4 is equal to 2, and the square root of 9 is equal to 3, and so the square root of 7 is in between the square root of 4 and the square root of 9. Let's do another one, the square root of 52. If we're trying to find out what two integers the square root of 52 is in between, we would say 7 and 8. Why would you say that, Miss Jackson? Well, because the square root of 52 tongue twister, is in between the square root of 49 and the square root of 56, okay? So like for instance, it was the square root of 49, the square root of 50, the square root of 51, the square root of 52, the square root of 53. And so that's why we would say it's between the integers 7 and 9, because the square root of 49 is, Miss Jackson made a mistake, guys. It should not be the square root of 56. It should be the square root between the square root of 49 and the square root of 56. So let me see, because listen, Miss Jackson liked to show mistakes and change them in real time, just so that you know that, hey, teachers, educators make mistakes too, and I'm okay with showing you that I did make a mistake, I caught it, and now I fixed it. All right, so the two integers again, the square root of 52 would be in between. That would be 7 and also 8. Let's do a couple more. Let's say we were looking for what the square root, what two integers the square root of 206 is in between. Well, we would say those two integers are 14 and 15, because the square root of 206 is in between the square root of 196 and the square root of 225. And just one more, what's the square root of an example, and we're going to do some ourselves. The square root of 150, well, that would be 12 and 13, because the square root of 150 is in between the square root of 144 and 169. The square root of 144 is 12, and the square root of 169 is 13. You will not always have a calculator, 8th graders, so it'll be good to just understand how you solve that, because as you know, you see, and as we go through, we'll look at some more examples, there's not going to always be a perfect square root. So the square roots that we have shown where it's just a whole number or an integer, those are called perfect square roots because it's not a decimal that's connected to it, okay? So let's try some more. Now, let's look at the square root of 40. Tell me what you think the two integers this square root would be in between. And also 181, same thing. What are the two integers that the square root of 181 would be in between, and why? All right, let's take a look. So for the square root of 40, our two integers are 6 and 7, because the square root of 40 is in between the square roots of 36 and the square root of 49. And then for the square root of 181, the two integers that square root is in between is 13 and 14, because the square root of 181 is in between the square root of 169 and 196. Okay, so that's an example of knowing what a square root is, finding the integer. If you don't have your handy dandy calculator, finding what the integers are that the square root is in between, because those are questions you may have. Now let's dive into how we use our calculator. So when we have our calculator and we're trying to find the square root, what we're going to do is we need to find the, in the example we're using is the TI 84 Plus calculator. We find the second key, and also the x squared button. And why do we do that? Because if you notice, and the second function key is highlighted in yellow, it has a yellow circle, and then the x squared button is circled in red. If you look right above the x squared, you see there is a light blue square root. Well, in order for us to engage that function, you have to click the second key and then x squared in order to have the square root appear, okay? So if we're looking for the square root of 40, what we would do is, Again, the second key and x squared, that will engage the square root. Then you type in 40, and if you notice, the square root of 40 is equal to 6.32 or 6 32/100. And this is an example, a great example of what I was talking about. There's not always a perfect square root, okay? So this is how you find a square root on your calculator. Let's try two more. We're going to be looking at the square root of 325 and also the square root of 107. And again, if you're not using, pretty much most of students use Texas Instrument calculators. If you don't use a TI calculator, what you should do is look for where the square root is and how do you engage that function, okay? So again, we're looking for the square root of 325 and the square root of 107. And we're going to round to the nearest hundredth, which is 2 decimal places behind the decimal, okay? So let's take a look at what that looks like. When you look at the square root of 325, our answer is, and let's look at what the calculator says, it's 18.0277563.8. Obviously not a perfect square root, right? So what we're going to do, since it said to round to the nearest hundredth, we look at, that's the second place behind the decimal, that's the 2. So we need to round. We look right next to the 2. We see that it's a 7. Because it is greater than 7 is greater than 5, we are going to round that 2 up to 3. So our answer for the square root of 325 is 18 3/100. Okay, now let's take a look at the square root of 107. And how do we find it? Even though we don't have our example here of how you get it, you push the second key on a TI calculator, you push the second key and then x squared, it engages the square root, and you type in 107. And our answer is 10.34408043. Okay, again, we are rounding to the nearest hundredth, which is the second decimal place behind the decimal point. That is a 4. So in order to find out what I need to round that 4 to, I'm going to immediately look to the right of that 4. It's another 4. Since 4 is less than 5, what we're going to do is keep our 4 the same. It is not going to round up like we did with that 3. So our answer for the square root of 107 is 10 34/100. Okay, now let's dive into our first problem. Which point on the number line best represents the location of the square root of 92? All right, is it A, point M, B, point N, C, point P, or D, point Q? Let's look at our number line. Okay, so on our number line, we see that we have 8, 9, and 10 as whole numbers. And in between, we have hash marks. So that's the halfway point. So the hash mark, or the line in between 8 and 9, that's 8.5. And then the line between 9 and 10, that's 9.5. Just so that we can kind of get an idea of the placement of our points. Okay, so we again are looking for the square root of 92. The first question we need to ask ourselves is, what are we looking for? Very important question. Most critical question, okay? We are looking for the point on the number line that best represents the location of the square root of 92. Now, with what we have right now, we can't really tell that, right? Because the square root of 92 is not a perfect square, and so we can't immediately say what answer choice is correct. That's one thing that I do want to say, 8th graders. Whenever you're solving a problem, it's multiple choice, it's better to answer the question first and then compare your answer to the answer choices so that you can get the correct answer. Because sometimes if you just try to depend on looking at the answer choices to find out what the correct answer is, it can get confusing, it can get overwhelming. But if you focus on solving that problem for yourself and then looking to see, okay, this is my answer, where in my answer choices does it show the same answer, then you significantly improve your chance of getting that question correct. Okay, so always solve your problem first, then once you have your answer, then look at the answer choices. Next question we need to know is, what information can help us find the answer? Well, the information that can help us find the answer is finding the square root of 92. Okay, finding the square root of 92. That is the information that can help us find the answer. So I put 92, and if you notice, I haven't said anything about the answer choices yet. I'm just walking along and I'm answering my problem, right? And then I'll compare it to the answer choices. So now we have the information that can help us find the answer. How are we going to solve the problem? The way that we're going to solve the problem is we need to plot our points and find out the point that's closest to the square root of 92, or 9.59, okay? The point that is closest to 9.59. So let's look at our answer choices again. And I want to talk about the number line one more time, because that is what's going to help us find the correct answer. Okay, so we said that we have a number line, and if you notice that the whole numbers 8, 9, and 10 are on there, and in between 8 and 9 there's another hash mark. Well, that's 8.5, okay, because that's the halfway point between 8 and 9. And between 9 and 10 there's a hash mark between 9 and 10. That's 9.5, or 9.5. okay, so one thing that I'll say is, okay, we know that point M is out of the running. So it's in, because we're looking, since our answer is 9.59, we know that it needs to be close to that halfway hash mark between 9 and 10. M and N, nowhere close. So we know A and B aren't the answer. And here we are. Just like Miss Jackson said, we're comparing our answer to what the answer choices are so that we can find the correct answer, okay? So we know the answer choices A and B. Now y'all wrong. Now we're going to move to C. Okay, C is point, which is point P, is right after the hash mark, and then Q is closer to 10. So what is our correct answer? Our correct answer is C, point P, because it is the point that's closest to 9.59. And that is it for part 1 of our square root review, 8th graders. Remember, you can purchase our 8th grade STAAR Math Review Workbook in our store. The link will be in the description box. This is Shay Jackson with Hype Math. I will talk to you later.